Vladimir Putin, the trajectory that Russia was on was a trajectory towards the death of a nation. Vladimir Putin reversed that trajectory. For better or for worse, for right or wrong, I'm just telling you a fact. If it weren't for Vladimir Putin, Russia wouldn't be what it is today. And I'll also tell you this, that if you're a Russian, when I was a weapons inspector in Vodkinsk, the town was collapsing because of defense industry, the peace, the effort to convert the defense industry into civilian, the general demise of the Soviet conditions. In Vodkinsk, the city, which is a factory town like many cities in Russia are, that everything is run by the factory. The factory has the money, they pay the salaries for the schools, they pay the salaries for everybody. So when the factory doesn't do well, the town doesn't do well, and Russia went into general decay. And from, say, 1989 to 1999, Russia decayed. It was a nation in decay. If you go and take photographs from 1999 and you compare to today, you will see a completely different nation, a nation reborn. Again, I'm not sitting here singing the praises of Vladimir Putin. I'm not pretending he's Mr. Democracy. I'm only saying that from the Russian perspective, Vladimir Putin raised the country out of the graveyard and brought it up to a level that makes it competitive in the world today. And the reason why I bring that up is that's the exact opposite trajectory we, the United States, want out of Russia. We've been against Vladimir Putin from day one. We've been pushing to have him removed from power from the very beginning. George Bush invited him to the branch, looked in his eyes and said, "I saw his soul." Well, I don't know what he saw, but he didn't see Vladimir Putin's soul. He saw Vladimir Putin looking around saying, "Yep, I got the measure of America. I know what needs to be done." In 2005, Vladimir Putin gave an address, April 2005, before the Federal Assembly. It's a well-quoted address, but it's always misquoted. What he said was that the fall of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest calamities in the 20th century. Now, it's been misquoted. People say he said it was the greatest calamity in the 20th century. And they're like, how could you compare the collapse of the Soviet Union with, Adolf Hitler's Holocaust and all this kind of stuff? Well, he wasn't trying to compare. He said it was one of the. But then the part that everybody misses, and this is the important part, because overnight, tens of millions of Russians became homeless. Under the Soviet Union, if you were a Russian living in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, the Baltics, you were part of a nation. You had a national identity. You had a home. That home was linked to Moscow. At the fall of the Soviet Union, you're a Russian living in those places. You no longer have a link to Moscow. You're linked to the respective capitals, and they don't view you as one of them. If you're a Russian in Uzbekistan, you're not an Uzbek. That's how it works. And he said, we abandoned them. And I, as the Russian president, must care for the Russian nation and the Russian people. Now, I'm not sitting here saying that's the right thing. I'm saying that's what he said. So the mindset of Vladimir Putin is one that says, I must care for the Russian people. That's my duty and responsibility as the leader of the Russian nation. And the nation is beyond the territorial boundaries of the Russian Federation. The nation is a nation that is based upon ethnicity, religion, culture. If you're Russian Orthodox, if you speak the Russian language, if you're linked to Russia through history, that's the nation. So that's what's in Vladimir Putin's mind. I have to protect the nation. In 2007, he gave one of the greatest speeches in history. And I'm not saying because I believe everything he said. I said it's a great speech. It's an important speech. It's the address he gave at the Munich Security Conference, where he stood up in front of the entire West and lectured them on what they were doing to Russia and what they were doing to the world. He spoke for an hour, or less than an hour. But the best part of it was the question and answer afterwards, where he was asked questions by all these political and economic elites of the West. And then he answered, and you watched them twitch, watched them squirm, as he hits them with fact about the role that the West was playing. How dare the West lecture him, the president of Russia, when they invade Iraq? Remember, this is 2007. Iraq was on everybody's mind. People don't like to think about Iraq today. We forget all that when we start pointing fingers at Vladimir Putin and the violation of national integrity, sovereignty, etc. We invaded Iraq in 2003. We violated their sovereignty, and no one cares about that today. The hypocrisy that's built into the West. But that's okay. Putin did, and that's why he brought it up. Then in 2008, NATO invites Ukraine to join NATO. Why? Well, we have some insight. In 2019, RAND Corporation, a think tank affiliated with the power elites in Washington, published a paper on how we can go about destroying Russia. Literally, it's not the literal title, but that's what they meant. What can we do to tear Russia apart, to bring it down? And one of the key things they said is to strip Ukraine away from the Russian sphere of interest. Strip it away, bring it to the West, and Russia will collapse. That was the goal. It's been the goal from the very beginning. And of course, Putin knows this. That's why he said, we will not allow Ukraine to join NATO. In 2009, February 2009, then Ambassador of the United States to Russia, William Burns, wrote a memorandum called Niet means Niet, no means no. And what he said there is that when Russia says Ukraine is a red line, they mean it. They're not joking. They're not bluffing. So we need to be very careful what our next steps are. Because, and this is the important part, ladies and gentlemen, because if we continue this policy, Russia will invade and Ukraine will lose the Donbass and Crimea. February 2009, we knew exactly what the consequences of our actions were. We knew that if we continued to pursue a policy to bring NATO or Ukraine into NATO, that this would end in a war that had Russia invading Ukraine and stripping the Donbass and Crimea away. We knew this, and yet we continued to pursue this policy, ladies and gentlemen. That should disturb everybody here. See, the people who've been promoting war with Russia, a Russian-Ukrainian conflict, don't reside in Moscow. They don't even reside in Kiev. They reside in Washington, D.C. They reside in London. They reside in Berlin. They reside in Paris. They reside in Brussels and Strasbourg, in the power centers of the collective West that has been trying to destroy Russia ever since Russia became a federated nation in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's why there's a war in Ukraine today. And that's why there will be no negotiated peace, because Russia is not going to negotiate with the people that have been trying to destroy them. You know, I wrote a book out there. It's called Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika. I think it's a fascinating book about the INF Treaty and arms control and the Soviet Union during that time and my experiences. But it's more than that. You see, if I told you, if I started out this saying, we live in difficult times, Russian troops and American troops are staring each other across the border, heavily armed. America's sanctioning Russia. Russia's avoiding the sanctions. And there's a threat of nuclear war. There was a nuclear exercise that almost spun out of control. And there was talks of using nuclear weapons. People say, yes, Scott, that's what happened the last couple of months. I said, nope, I'm talking about the 1980s. See, 1980s, it was pretty bad. It was very bad. The INF Treaty, an arms control treaty to get rid of intermediate nuclear forces, that is, ballistic missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 miles, saved the world from nuclear annihilation. Had we not gotten rid of those weapons, I'm here to tell you right now, we wouldn't be here today, because there is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. Those weapons would have been used, and after they were used, the world would end in a general nuclear exchange. That is just a statement of fact. Study the nuclear doctrine of either the Soviet Union at the time or the United States, and you will understand the moment one nuclear weapon is used, they all get used. And we got rid of those weapons. And in doing so, we started a process of working cooperatively with the Soviet Union to find the off-ramp away from nuclear annihilation and permanent confrontation to peaceful coexistence. You see, the INF Treaty is what I call a template of hope. A template of hope. And that's why I think it's important to read the book, because it shows that we can get out of this problem. Bad news, though. The Russians don't want to talk to us. See, on November 29th, the Russians and the Americans were supposed to meet in Cairo to discuss the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, to sit down and say, how can we get this treaty back on track? How can we begin the process of discussing responsible nuclear disarmament and maybe move in a direction where we can take down some of the weapons that are threatening European peace and security? The Russians withdrew. People say, of course they withdrew, those dirty Russians. They want to cause trouble. But what the Russians said is, How can you expect us to sit down at a table and negotiate with you at a time when your policy literally is to kill Russian soldiers in Ukraine? When your Secretary of Defense comes out and says we're providing billions of dollars of support to the Ukrainian military for the sole purpose of bringing pain to the Russian military, we want to inflict harm on the Russian military, so much so that they will never again seek to do what they're doing in Ukraine. That is the stated policy of Lloyd Austin, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and the rest of the Biden administration, to kill Russian soldiers. Think about it for a second, and now go back in history when we were back in Afghanistan. Do you remember the bounties, the Russian bounties? The big story? Those dirty Russians were paying the Taliban bounties to kill Americans, and we were up in arms. It was fake. It never happened. It was one of these mainstream media garbage. But the point is, the mere thought that Russia would pay money to the Taliban to kill 1, 2, 3 Americans sickened us collectively. Ladies and gentlemen, the United States is paying $56 to $100 billion to the Ukrainians to kill thousands of Russians. And you expect the Russians to sit at the table with us? We are imposing sanctions on Russia. These sanctions aren't designed to hurt Putin, the oligarchs. No, these sanctions were specifically designed to cripple the Russian people, to deny them livelihood, to collapse their economy so that their children couldn't go to school, couldn't have health care, there wouldn't be a future. That was the purpose of the sanctions. Now, it didn't happen because the Russians happen to be a little bit smarter about energy security, global energy security than the West. Here's a pro hint. If you're going to call a nation a gas station disguised as a country, that's sort of what the United States have been calling Russia for some time. They're just a gas station disguised as a country. Don't be a big American automobile on a superhighway in the middle of nowhere with an empty gas tank, because that's what the Western economy is right now. It's stuck in the middle of nowhere in desperate need of the energy that Russia was providing, lacking it. Prices are going up. German economy is collapsing. French economy is collapsing. The British economy, Europe is collapsing. You know who's not collapsing? Us. We're paying a little bit higher prices, but because we're the good friends of Europe, I mean, we are really good friends of Europe. We're their NATO allies, by the way. When we denied them access to cheap Russian gas, we volunteered to sell expensive American liquid natural gas. Now, as a good friend, we would say, you're going to get it at the same price you're paying for the Russians because we don't want to harm your economy. No, we're making them pay 10 to 20 times more. We're raking in the money, the profits. Not only that, we're destroying the German economy to the point that 1 out of every 4 industry jobs are going to come to the United States in the next year because they can't afford to stay in Germany. That's what it's like to be a friend of America. But the point is, the sanctions didn't work, but the intent of the sanctions was to hurt the Russian people. The Russians have said, we can't sit at a table with people who continue to try and kill our troops and make our people suffer through sanctions. That when you talk about trust but verify, we don't want to just talk about the verification procedures of an arms control agreement. We want to talk about the trust between nations. And right now, there is no trust between nations. Russia will never trust the West again. So if you want to talk about a peaceful resolution, if you're truly anti-war, the fundamental question is, how can the West regain the trust of Russia? And it is incumbent upon the West to do it, not on Russia. Russia doesn't need to gain the trust of the West. It's not Russia that has betrayed the West. It's the West that betrayed Russia. So now we come down to the final point. How do we get out of this war? And the sad fact is we don't, ladies and gentlemen, because there's no one right now in Washington, D.C. who's thinking about how do we reestablish trust with Russia. Russia is fully committed to winning this war. 10 to 15 division equivalents are arriving on the battlefield in the next month. And once they arrive there, they're going to begin the process of destroying the Ukrainian army. Now we come back to what I started. Destroying the Ukrainian army sounds pretty copacetic, doesn't it? It means they're going to fire artillery rounds into their gut men. They're going to have their guts split open, leaning on the ground, and they're going to suffer for hours while they bleed out, get infected, and die. That's war. They're going to shoot people. Sometimes you die instantly, sometimes you don't. They're going to use thermobaric weapons which are going to suck the lungs out of people. That's war, ladies and gentlemen. That's what's going to happen over the course of the next weeks and months. Hundreds of thousands of people are going to die because we can't find a way to negotiate with the Russians.